I'd like to acknowledge that in the midst of all of the joy and the beauty, that there is also a lot going on. This is a really difficult time. And it's hard, it's wearing, it's hard on our souls, it's hard on our minds and bodies. And in Buddhism, we are invited to take refuge. Take refuge in the Buddha and the Dharma and the Sangha. And the Buddha, you could say, substitute God, spirit of life. Some greater power, perhaps, if you choose to believe in that kind of thing. And the Dharma is the teachings. For us, that would be our values and principles. And the Sangha is the community. In Buddhism, it's the community of those who share that path, but in a sense, it is any community that shares a path together. And I would also say that that could be the community of all beings that we are a part of. So I invite you now to close your eyes if you're comfortable doing so. Relax. Let some of the tension fall away. Take a few deep breaths. And to take refuge now. This poem from Pablo Neruda expresses this very well for me in this moment. Turn to me, O sun, towards my native destiny. Rain from the ancient forest, return to me the fragrance and the swords that fall from the sky, the solitary peace of field and rock, the moisture at the margins of the river, the scent of the larch, the wind alive like a heart beating among the remote flock of the great Araucaria. Earth, return to me your pure gifts, the towers of silence that rose from the solemnity of their roots. I want to return to being what I have not been. Learn to return from such depths that amongst all the things of nature, I could live or not live. No matter, to be one more stone, the dark stone, the pure stone that is carried by the river. Many years ago, I'm not on. Okay. Start over. Many years ago, when my mother was still alive and I was much younger, I'd gone home to stay for a while and take some time to sort my life out, as you sometimes do when you're younger, sometimes do when you're my age too. And my mother's house sits on the eastern foothills of the Franklin Mountains in El Paso at about 4,200 feet in elevation. And the mountains rise rapidly to the west to almost 7,000 feet. So as the sun goes down behind the mountains, her house is in shadow early, and you can watch the mountain shadows lengthen across the desert until they meet the night arriving from the east. So one evening I was washing the dinner dishes, and from the kitchen you could see that dusk had fallen across the backyard. And then the yard began to glow. And the trees and the pool and the deck and everything out the kitchen window was suddenly suffused with bright golden light. And I stopped what I was doing and I ran out and I looked up at the sky. And above me, a column of clouds extended far up, thousands of feet higher than the mountaintops. And the top of that column was catching the last rays of the setting sun and channeling those rays downward like some enormous fiber optic cable. And some trick of the light focused it in a circle, perhaps 30 yards across, maybe 50, with our house and yard at the very center. And the neighbors' yards were dim. And I was awestruck. And I stood there awestruck as the light changed from golden orange to peach, faded into pink, and then to gray. And then the night from the east swept over it all, leaving the world in silent darkness. We live on the earth, yes, but we also live in the sky, and the sky is not just above it, it comes all the way down to the ground. The earth is solid to our senses. Most of the time it changes relatively slowly. Eons pass as continents slowly drift across the world and mountains rise and fall. But the sky on the other hand, is liquid and quick, constantly changing. In the blue dome, clouds form and dissipate. Rain and snow come and go. The winds change direction and strength. And above all that, the moon and the sun and the stars keep time. And oh, those stars. On a clear, cold night with no light pollution, it can be said that you are viewing eternity. Space and time stretching out to infinity. In the days and the months and the years, the heavens mark their passage to the beat of this cosmic dance. Now, to an unknowing observer on the ground, they appear to be at the center of all this activity. That the earth, and by implication the observer, is at the center of the universe. And for a long time, this was not in dispute. A spherical earth, fixed at the center, was surrounded by an enormous celestial sphere of crystal that held the stars and rotated around us once a day. And the sun and the moon and the planets were somewhere in between, carried around in their circles by yet more crystal spheres. And all kinds of complicated schemes were proposed to account for things like retrograde motion, where the planets appear to move backward in the sky. And beyond that last crystal sphere was heaven, home of God and the angels. In In 1543, Copernicus published his great work on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres and removed the Earth from the center of the cosmos. He placed the sun at the center of the universe. But it would only be a very short time before that perspective would also be discarded, and we would come to understand that the universe has no center, and that our planet is only a minuscule speck in a cosmos so vast as to be beyond comprehension. And while the Copernican and subsequent astronomical revelations removed the Earth from the center of the universe scientifically, it did not remove humans and humanity from the emotional, theological, or psychological center. Observed truth to the contrary, humanity still acts as if it is at the center of the universe. We now inhabit a world that most of us experience as being filled with the works of humankind. Particularly in the developed countries, but increasingly in the rest of the world, we mostly see other humans in our works. Mostly hear the sounds of humans, think mostly about ideas and viewpoints generated by humans. The sky is so filled with our waste light that most of us can no longer see more than a few stars, and we have lost touch with eternity. Over half of humanity now lives in a built environment, a city, filled with other humans. And everything has come to revolve around us and our needs. And as the world has filled up with people, we are increasingly unable to find external reference points that allow us to place ourselves in relationship with other beings, the Earth's ecosystems, and ultimately the cosmos. I call this being lost in the Hall of Mirrors, a world that has become so self-referential that is losing touch with any reality but our own self-generated one. And I think this is incredibly dangerous. To be at the center of the universe is a very real thing. As individuals, we have needs and wants and concerns. Concerns for survival, safety, and well-being that are paramount to our lives, as well as the stories and ideas that we build our lives around. And this is also true of the groups that we belong to. And so here on this minuscule speck, in an apparently lonely and unforgiving universe, it would seem all too natural for us to hold on to our anthropocentrism as the only source of meaning. It's easy and all too human to forget that being at the center of the universe is also an unreal and unnatural condition. The old cosmologies contained what we might call the divine perspective, that humans were subject to greater mysterious powers in the universe, powers that demanded a certain humility of us. The great revolution currently taking place in human affairs is one of taking into account the perspectives of other observers, other cultures, of the human community at large, rather than a single cultural viewpoint. Whether this revolution will succeed remains to be seen. And it may be that unless we can also know the perspectives of non-human beings and regain some sense of cosmic scale, this revolution will also fail. Because the perspectives of other human observers are still human perspectives. And without some cosmic or divine perspective and the points of view of other beings, without some way to break out of the self-referential trap, we're still caught in that hall of mirrors. Now, one problem with this is that perhaps the divine perspective is simply our projection. Per William Ellery Channing, who wrote, "The idea of God, sublime and awful as it is the idea of our own spiritual nature, purified and enlarged to infinity. In ourselves are the elements of the divinity." The other Western rational objection is that there is no way of knowing, no epistemology that is not created by, interpreted by, or mediated by human beings. That it is impossible to know or understand what non-human beings, birds, mammals, fish, trees, for instance, are thinking or feeling, or how they perceive the world. Now, there is a certain humility in knowing the limits of our understanding, and yet, there's also a certain arrogance here, coming back to what it is that human beings can or cannot know, and who decides that? Human beings. Perhaps that idea allows us to cut ourselves off from the other and reinforces our anthropocentrism. It has the human knower standing firmly at the center as the only active agent of knowing in a passive known world. But what if the world, and likely the universe, is full of agency, of other than human persons? So we must ask, what are persons? Who is a person? Graham Harvey writes that persons are volitional, relational, cultural, and social beings. They demonstrate intentionality and agency with varying degrees of autonomy and freedom. Person is one who communicates. Persons may be spoken with. Objects, by contrast, are usually spoken about. We usually think of persons as other people, most of the time. But this other view says that persons can be plants, or animals, or insects, or fish, or anything that exhibits agency, or anything which you decide to treat as a person. Our knowledge of them is created through relationship, through engagement with them, rather than standing apart, through conversation rather than passive understanding. There are many knowers in the world. What do they know about us through their engagement with human beings? I wonder. The point, though, is that we know together by being immersed together in knowing each other. The universe of the crystal spheres held the Earth to be a fixed point. It was a Cartesian world filled with objects acting on each other in predictable and mechanistic ways, like so many billiard balls bouncing off each other. It was a flat, two-dimensional either-or world. An anthropomorphic, male-centered, materialistic view of the cosmos. It was a hierarchical world with God on top, followed by the angels, humanity in the middle, with animals, plants, and inanimate matter below. And of course, the humans decided that since there was this hierarchy, they'd create one of their own, with the men on top and women, and we know all that messiness. After all, as above, so below, right? It was a world that placed the transcendent divine on the other side of the sky, knowable by mere earthlings only after death, or via uncertain mystical experience. And this worldview is still deeply embedded in our culture. So we might contrast with this with an interwoven world made up of persons and their multiple perspectives. A world engaged in conversation and knowing by way of mutuality. A co-created world where the divine is immanent and knowable by all the participants. And eternity is present everywhere. A fluid and dynamic web inhabited by skylings. As good a word as any, I suppose, skylings instead of earthlings, sharing the world with other skylings. Helps to shift these things every once in a while. Although in truth, we are all creatures of both earth and sky. The questions of how we see ourselves and are seen, how we engage with other beings of all kinds, and how we arrive at knowledge and understanding, these questions have always been present. Different cultures have arrived at different answers. The answers may or may not have been implicit or explicit. But answering these questions in an intentional way is at the forefront of our time. And how we answer these questions is more critical than ever before. Now, El Paso is situated in what is called basin and range country. So there are mountain ranges separated by miles of flat and barren land, what appears to be barren land. There aren't really any trees. I like to say that you can see the bones of the earth there. And from my mother's house, you could look east across the desert basin to the mountains some 40 miles away. And from that vantage in the foothills, you could see sideways and up into the volume of the sky and all that happened there. The daily play of color and shadow, the clouds forming and dissolving in shifting layers of the air. You could watch entire thunderheads as they marched across the desert, pierced by lightning, dumping rain. And you knew, because you'd been there, that to be under one of those storm cells was to drive very slowly on streets flooded with 3 to 6 inches of water, driving in rain so dense that visibility was measured in mere yards, subject to a literally higher power. And that these things were both true and different for you than they were for the hawk flying away from the storm in a hurry. And in the pouring rain, the smaller birds sheltered under the eaves of houses. And the lizards scurried for higher ground, and it was different for them, and yet the same. And the truth is, any one of us could be swept away. Living in the sky seems to be our natural condition. Living in the sky is to live in 3 or 4 dimensions, not 2. A world of no fixed points, no privileged view. A world with no center, only places to pause from time to time. Living in the sky asks that we honor multiple perspectives and know their truth, to be above the storm and in it, and under it, scurrying for higher ground with the lizards and the mice. Living in the sky asks us to be humble, for without the other to know with, we cannot really know what it is we need to know.